Hi, and welcome to CSOSA's DC Public Safety. I'm your host, Nancy Ware. The topic for today's TV show is the intersection of faith, social action, and criminal justice. In a May 2016 letter to the U.S. Senate, over 60 faith-based organizations from across the country called for the passage of bipartisan criminal justice reform legislation, noting that as people of faith, we are called to comfort and serve those harmed by crime and support accountability, rehabilitation, and restoration for those who offend. Collective advocacy around public policy at this level is not uncommon for national faith organizations. In times of crisis and tragedy, members of the clergy are often visible leaders in the community's response to the unfolding events. Apart from these dramatic events, many religious leaders are involved with local collaborations that are engaged in ongoing activism on social issues that address the spectrum of criminal justice challenges. Joining me today to discuss this important topic are Reverend Donald Isaac, founder, East of the River Clergy Police Community Partnership, and former chair of CSOSA's Faith Advisory Council, and Ms. Addie Richburg, president and chairman of the National Alliance of Faith and Justice. Reverend Isaac and Ms. Richburg, welcome to DC Public Safety.
Thank you for having us.
I'm so excited about this conversation because, as you know, there's been a lot going on around the country and locally in the District of Columbia. And I would like for you to be able to talk a little bit about some of your perspectives on the theological imperative for faith communities to be involved in responding to criminal justice matters. So I'll start with you, Addie, if you don't mind, and ask you to just get us started, and then I'll turn it over to Reverend Isaac.
Well, I come from a background that, from a child through my adulthood, believed that the faith community was a major imperative of social action. My most recent career ended in retirement from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, I served as the volunteer coordinator administrator for 15,000 volunteers across the country who came into the Federal Bureau of Prisons, over 100 institutions, many of them, over 80% of them, serving as religious volunteers, hoping in some way to be able to assist people in their transition in coming back to society, starting with the renewal and restoration of their lives on a faith-based perspective. And in that way, I had an opportunity many times to see the faith community really go to work on an interfaith level to begin to try to infuse issues such as renewal, restoration, forgiveness, healing, and to help persons who had been touched by criminal justice to prepare for the gamut of issues that they would face on the outside. Many of those faith volunteers came in with a perspective of having family members who had been touched by criminal justice. Many of them had had family members who were serving time or impacted by someone who was in prison. And many of them recognized the many challenges that were faced on the outside by children, by wives, by siblings, and et cetera, trying to help to support men and women who were in criminal justice. But the one thing that I noticed over everything was that the faith imperative was foremost, and that the desire to help men and women to come back to society and to heal and to transition was one of the things that the religious imperative had at its center.
Well, I think you speak to a lot of what we always have to focus on in terms of that pre-release discussion before people actually leave institutions where they've been incarcerated for many years, and how we prepare them to come out, and how the religious community, the faith community, plays such an important role in that regard. Reverend Isaac is a local pastor and a community leader, I would like to say. I know that you've had a number of experiences, but I'm curious, and I'd like our public to hear how they've shaped your commitment to criminal justice, because you've been working with CSOSA, I know, for quite a while.
Yes, well, as Addie indicated, I think that social justice and being connected to the issues of our community are a mandate of any faith institution. And I think my perspective is developed, first of all, from a historical perspective. When you look at this country and you look at the history, particularly of African American or other disadvantaged groups within this country, the issue of slavery, the faith community was at the forefront of addressing this issue of slavery. Post-Emancipation Proclamation, as we look at segregation throughout this country, and as we look even at Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, or being a leader of the faith community. And then subsequently, as we've continued to go on, I think that mandate is still the same. And as we look today at issues of incarceration, youth violence, family homelessness, there are all issues that the faith community has a mandate spiritually to address.
I agree, and I think that we really can't expect to get a handle on some of these challenges unless we partner very closely with the faith community of any denomination. I do want to hear a little bit more about some of the work that you've been engaged in and how you think we can mobilize more around citizens throughout the city, particularly, and throughout the nation, in getting engaged through their faith communities in the work of criminal justice reform. Eddie, you want to start on the national perspective?
Yes, my late husband, Reverend Warren Dolphus, was a chaplain in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and an ordained African American Episcopal elder. One of the things he would see as a chaplain would be many churches who came into the prisons and jails across the country with the specific and exclusive mandate of working in the religious capacity and not necessarily sometimes seeing the broader picture of what can be done to reach the full person, the different obstacles he or she might face, not only on a moral basis, but those things that were on a more social basis. So he began to feel a calling and compelling to establish some type of work outside of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and in the community that later became a committee of the National Association of Blacks in Criminal Justice, to be known then as the National Religious Affairs Association, our committee of NABJA, and then finally, as it is now named, the National Alliance of Faith and Justice. In that, we see that there is a need and there is always a desire to have training and understanding, a better understanding of how we can go about working with men and women and their children in a holistic basis as they are impacted by crime. One of the specific things that we've done on an annual basis to try to kind of jumpstart that is an annual commemoration we call Justice Sunday. And it's done across the country in many cities now, and we're just really, really happy that one of those cities is Washington, D.C. And we're very happy to have as our partner each year Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency. One of the things that we do is each year we visit a specific church in the city of D.C. that becomes our host for Justice Sunday. And during that commemoration, which is always held on the Sunday that's the day before the Martin Luther King Day of Service, so that we begin that commitment the day before that continues on the day after and beyond for that whole year. We begin to remind people of how service intersects with faith, and how in our own individual ways, be they many, we have a way to touch the lives of many people from a varied perspective. For CSOSA, it's always been the first day of reentry reflections, which provides an opportunity here in the city for the churches in the various social ministry capacities to start and to convene and to continue many aspects of ministry that go into the outreach capacity. Mm-hmm. Many times churches only establish ministries that deal with our persons who are touched by criminal justice as prison and jail ministries, but it goes so much further than that. It's housing, it's health, it's homelessness, it's mental health, it's a number of different things that the church is already involved in, and that on Reentry Reflections we see a varied degree of programs that occur for an entire month, beginning Justice Sunday and going through February, traditionally, obviously, Black History Month, as so many of African Americans are touched. But it's an opportunity for NAFJ to get people started at the beginning of the year, thinking about Dr. King, as Reverend Isaac said, and how Dr. King served in the community and how men and women of civil rights served the broader community.
And we do have a rich history of the faith community being involved, as you both have noted, in the criminal justice issues, but also the issues of disenfranchisement and how we need to address those issues. On the political scale, though, are there ways that the faith community, Reverend Isaac, in your opinion, here in the District of Columbia could play a more integral role in mapping out our direction around criminal justice issues here?
Absolutely. Well, and I think the starting point is within the faith institutions themselves. As Addie indicated, and I thank her for invoking the remembrance of one, her late husband, who we sat in the room together. Mm-hmm. And one of the goals was, how can we get faith institutions who had basically focused inwardly for the most part to direct their attention, their energies, their volunteers, and their capacity to those outside of the local faith community. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the initial goals. With that also, you would begin to address issues of advocacy, issues of service delivery, things that really many faith institutions, we talked about it, that in particular in the African American church, we were very good at having worship, and we were very good at the church calendar, but we were struggling to try to figure out how do we get that same level of energy and commitment to those who were in need around the church.
Mm-hmm. So social issues, as they're identified through our religious organizations and faith institutions, there's sometimes been a prohibition of sorts, maybe an informal prohibition for these institutions to become too engaged in social reform, too engaged in politics. Can you speak to that and what your perceptions are of some of those prohibitions historically, and how the faith community's begun to overcome those, or has overcome them over the years? And as you said, our civil rights era certainly addressed a lot of that, but I know it's been challenging at times.
A lot of the change I began to see began to happen with the creation of the White House Faith and Neighborhood Initiative. Prior to that, I must admit, as you've said, that many churches were very reluctant to cross-pollinate issues of particularly faith and government. There was a feeling that government was not something that should necessarily enter into the religious atmosphere, and not saying that there should not be some interfaith interaction between the government and faith, but a lot of that, I think, did not necessarily deal with the resistance to action or the resistance to work. It dealt with more of a fear, perhaps, of how there might be interference within the role of religious practices and et cetera. But I have seen over the years, since the creation of the Faith-Based Initiative, that there have been a lot more training. And I've also seen that happen, of course, with court services and offender supervision agencies in working outside of the construct of the governmental work that the agency does, or agencies across the country. Just examples that come to mind of different things. Like there is a Federal Reentry Council now. And I know that CSOSA and the White House Office of Faith and Neighborhood Partnerships are part of. And this helps people to see on a broader scale what some of the agency practices may be and some of the agency mandates may be, and how then the church may look at those things and intersect with those.
Involvement in that.
Yes.
Did you want to wrap that up a little bit?
I just wrap it up by a personal belief is when I look at dealing with the government, and I've done a lot of work with the government, I uphold the scripture that says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So I believe that government resources come from tax dollars and should be used. Secondly, I believe that as we look in government agencies, there are many people of goodwill and faith in those institutions.
I agree.
So as we develop ways that becomes another way that they can exercise their faith
Absolutely.
through their professions.
Well, thank you both, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us for the next segment as we delve into how CSOSA partners with faith-based institutions at the intersection of faith, social action, and criminal justice. You're watching DC Public Safety.
Kev. Hey, Kev, what's going on?
In the digital world, kids can be anywhere. Know where they go. Visit www.knowwheretheygo.org to learn more.
Hi, and welcome back to DC Public Safety. I'm your host, Nancy Ware. As we now turn the conversation to how CSOSA partners with the faith community to address the needs of the justice-involved population, I am once again joined by Reverend Donald Isaac, founder, East of the River Clergy Police Community Partnership, and former chair of CSOSA's Faith Advisory Council, and Reverend Michael Bell, CSOSA's Faith-Based Initiative Coordinator. Reverend Isaac and Reverend Bell, thank you for so much for joining us, and welcome to DC Public Safety.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to start off, Reverend Bell, with a question about what really brought you to the to this work and the theological implications of joining the faith-based community with the work that we do in trying to reform criminal justice.
Yes, ma'am. I think, like many others, I was brought up in a family that was impacted from incarceration, family members, and their recovery or their re-entry back into life. As a matter of fact, my family often jokes of me during the time when you could go into the prison system and sit with your family member on the yard. As a 5-year-old, I was standing on the tables in the yard preaching to my uncle, telling him he better get his stuff together. We need to see him at home. So my family, my life itself has been touched in that way. But also I am a product, fifth generation preacher from a socially conscious black church. And the gospel that was presented to me for as long as I can remember is one that not only preaches about the burden of the individual self seeking to do better, to attain greater, but also that burden incorporates our care for community and how we help others to stand and to recover. And so that brings me to this work.
Well, Reverend Isaac, in 2001, you were a part of really helping CSOSA to convene our faith-based initiative, and I'd like you to share a little bit about those years and some of the work that went into that, and philosophically where you saw or forecasted that work would evolve over the years. And then I'd like to come back to Reverend Bell and talk a little bit more about how we use those early historical moments to bring us to where we are today, and some of the things that you see us going towards as we move forward in the future with our faith-based initiative at CSOSA.
Yes, it's an interesting history. I think in year 2000, I left the DC government at that time in mid-career almost to pursue full-time ministry. And at the same time, right around that 2000, it was 1999, 2000, CSOSA was being formed as well. And I think always, whenever I get an opportunity, commend CSOSA, because I think it has set an example as a government agency of what community collaboration and community partnership looks like. So from day one, they were actively with their community outreach workers reaching out to the faith community in particular. And we ended up sitting around a chair at CSOSA trying to figure out if Dr. King was alive today. It was, I think, in the month of January, George Bush was president. He had declared it National Mentoring Month. What would Dr. King do? And we reached the conclusion that incarceration would be on Dr. King's agenda. That sort of was the impetus for us getting together. We had the call of action, which I think is a part of the documented history at Israel Baptist Church. And even I, as one of the organizers and one of the persons who issued the call, was just overwhelmed by the response. Because what had happened at that time was that Lorton had closed. There were hundreds of persons who had done prison ministry inside the prisons for years, who no longer now had a prison, and were looking for an opportunity to work out their faith and their service to those persons who were coming home from incarceration.
That's very powerful, and it builds on what Addie Richburg was talking about in the first segment in terms of calling folks to action and the response from folks who have been out there doing this work as prison ministers.
Yes.
Reverend Bell, how are you going to take all that rich history and evolve our faith-based initiative as you see it today?
Well, first of all, of course, I would like to celebrate the history that we come from. It has made a major and considerable impact here in the District of Columbia. And because of the work of those who have been the forerunners of this effort, this agency, and community action, such as Reverend Isaac, and of course the leadership that you give, one of the things that we want to make sure is that our community, it is constantly communicated to them, the unique blessing as a community that we have to the resources that are available. I see my work at this present moment more so as a bridge, as it were, to make sure that we maintain a celebration and a motivation of our history, but also to try our best to collect all of these young men and women who are socially conscious, those who have been impacted in the way that we see across the television screens daily within our communities, and to bring it together, an organized effort to recruit, definitely to train, and then of course to maintain the kind of partnership CSOSA and faith-based institutions in our community have traditionally held to in order to make an impact.
I'm looking forward to seeing how we continue to move this this needle forward in terms of engaging not just our faith-based partners, but also other community partners as a part of this. Reverend Isaac, since you've been a longtime resident of the district, I think, were you born here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you are one of our first families of the district. I think it's important to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you see in engaging the faith community and making sure that it's an open and inclusive engagement and not a non-denominational engagement. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, well, first of all, we must collaborate. You indicated that I was a founder of East of the River Clergy Police Community Partnership, a very long name, but it reflected that we should have involvement from all of those various entities. And within the faith community, I was brought up Baptist, but I said I've learned as much about ministry from some of my Presbyterian and Lutheran friends in a short period of time than a lifetime of being a Baptist, so we can learn all one from another. I think one of the big challenges that we have is that we have to acknowledge the point that success means nothing without successors. So I say that by way of giving kudos to the agency for bringing on Reverend Bell, who I think is of the next generation. We must understand that there is a limit to our ability God has not made us to do in the spring and summer what we do in the fall and winter what we did in the spring and summer. So I think that those of us who have set the foundation must begin to reach back to the generations that are behind us and begin to give them wisdom, direction, and guidance, but also to allow them to take the reins and really give leadership to the movement.
I think that's interesting too that you focused this on the movement. I think that's something that is probably giving credit to our history as well, and also our future as well. And so I think it's important as we look forward and engage our faith-based partners in this movement that we talk a little bit more about how best to make sure that these faith institutions don't become so insular, but that they open up to the issues that are facing our community in Washington, D.C. And I would like to hear more from both of you as to the best ways to do that.
Well, I think it actually all goes back to your first question about the theological implications, right? Mm-hmm. All of the great religions have, as a part of their constitution, these same principles, regardless of whether you're talking about Christian traditions or Islam or any of the other great religions within the world. This sense of being co-creators in beloved community. We all come and approach it in many of the same ways. My tradition, of course, being Christian, and not to be preacherly at all, but I recall the text of Luke where Jesus enters the temple and his first initial sermon to the world is not only that I've been anointed to preach goodness to the poor, but that I must set at liberty those who have been held captive. That is one of the great principles of faith across the board. And I think through networking and communication, our efforts are not just in the Christian tradition, whether they be Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, but also an interfaith kind of dialogue that reaches beyond these traditional notions of who is actually engaged into this work. There's a lot of great work being done by our Islamic brothers and sisters and our Sikh brothers and sisters and numerous other religions. So we want to make sure that we find a way to organize, if at least through communication, to engage this work.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I do think that what we found often in the institutions is that there is a broad array of religious interest, of faith interest, and spiritual interest. And so I think for us as an agency working with this population, it's important for us to capture the spirituality of the individuals that we work with so that they don't lose hope. Mm-hmm. I think that really is an important component to the work that we do. Can you all speak a little bit more to that and how best to approach that?
Well, I think at this point in my life, I'm giving focus on the economic foundations or the poverty, the systemic issues which are linked to poverty and economics. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that if we're going to answer the question of reentry, if we're going to answer the question of individuals changing their lives, if we're going to address the matter of communities being transformed, then we must address the issues of economics, creating entities, in my viewpoint now, even business, social enterprises that will allow people to obtain living wages that can provide housing, take care of families. And I found that in working with young people throughout the city, that economics is a major factor in changing one's, decision making and their emphasis in life.
Some of us were talking with members of the city who are trying to make some changes in the city, particularly in difficult communities within the city. And, the whole feeling of that disenfranchisement and that lack of really a sense of who they are and their heritage and their commitment to making a change in the city that's positive is going to be a major challenge for us. Thank you both. I want to thank you, Reverend Isaac and Reverend Michael Bell. I want to thank you also, our audience, for watching today's show. You can learn more about CSOSA's Faith-Based Initiative at www.csosa.gov. Join us next time as we discuss another important topic in today's criminal justice system. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.